Apps and Compute Question Examples based on AWS Data Engineer Topics by abylead. We offer cloud service introductions, exam question explanations, and practicing of real exams. Question 1. How do you most cost-effective make a large Redshift dataset available to vendors via API? Less efficient and costly is to integrate API gateway with Redshift or a custom API hosted on ECS to query Redshift. Also, step functions with DynamoDB adds complexity and overhead. Better is processing with a scalable event-driven app to S3 with API gateway as a proxy to third-party vendors without fixed costs. Question 2. How do you realize a highly scalable and cost-effective down and upload via API of a large S3 dataset? To use EC2 with load balancer involves high fixed costs with overhead, and ECS Fargate comes with high container operation costs. Besides, EKS orchestration is too complex for this use case. In contrast, a serverless architecture without fixed costs provides direct S3 storage access via API gateway as proxy with Lambda. Question 3. How do you continuously transfer with least overhead from SAS apps to Redshift for reporting? High operational overhead and non-continuous SAS flows to Redshift are provided by EventBridge rule or Apache Airflow with JDBC connector. The same is true for custom Lambda functions as part of SQL queries. Most advisable is to continuously send data with event-triggered AppFlow for SAS apps to Redshift with least overhead. Question 4. How do you reuse Python code and cron for an employee time tracking in AWS with S3 Data Lake? Wrong is to launch browser-based Cloud Shell from console, and Python libraries in AWS Cloud 9 don't use AWS services. Furthermore, SDK for Python and with cron schedule generates fixed costs and overhead. The solution is to process events with Lambda and Python to AWS services central scheduled by serverless EventBridge. Question 5. How do you invoke a Lambda function to write load statuses in Redshift to the DynamoDB table? Splitting Lambda function into avoidable tasks limits scalability, and you can't capture operational events with CloudTrail logging. Moreover, SQS buffered decoupling doesn't distribute in real time. You better use scalable table tracking with Redshift Data API to send events via EventBridge rule and Lambda. Question 6. How do you realize serverless deployment with IAC for ingestion and transformation pipelines across accounts and regions? It's inefficient to deploy serverless resources with CloudFront. Also impractical is code build or S3 storage for provisioning infrastructure as code. Instead, deploy with the serverless app model with secure linked secrets in SSM parameter store. Question 7. How do you remove messages from an SQS queue with an API event? Infeasible is to remove queue messages with QEdit with the receive message call or the SQS visibility timeout. The 3 removal features are the delete message API for single messages, the max receive count to auto-remove excess messages, or the purge to delete all messages. Hold on a minute. If you like this channel and its free content to continue, please subscribe to it on the right bottom button. Question 8. How do you realize an auto-scalable 10-minute lasting data processing task with infrequent triggering? It's not a good idea to handle real-time events with CloudWatch alarms, and EventBridge is suboptimal for on-demand events. Besides, step functions isn't highly scalable. You best apply SNS fanout to SQS queue with parallel messaging for sporadic and high dynamic loads to Lambda without fixed costs. Question 9. How do you ensure that backups aren't stored in non-compliant regions? AWS Backup Service isn't designed for individual service replications and snapshots. Infeasible is to control backup or snapshot storage with CloudFront or the Resource Access Manager. In contrast, you apply backup with each individual service to control data storage location. Question 10. How do you optimize container performance for these needs? Tasked with improving the performance of a data processing on ECS with rapid scaling. Unsuitable for rapid scaling or high throughput are EC2 spot instances, increased CPU and memory allocations, or customized Lambda scaling. But with auto-scaled ECS cluster, you can fast scale for fluctuating traffic and use its metric policies for cost-effective utilization. Question 11. How do you most cost-effective optimize Kubernetes data processing app for variable load with spikes? ECS with auto-scaling isn't adequate for Kubernetes native apps and its features. Moreover, manual scaling can't handle unpredictable spikes. Better is to engage EKS specifically designed for Kubernetes with its horizontal pod autoscaler. Question 12. How do you deploy a containerized high-performance data processing app with maximized usage? To control intensive processing power, you can't use simplified Lambda scaling or ECS serverless containers. Additionally, manual scaling can't handle unpredictable spikes. Instead, EKS with horizontal pod autoscaling provides granular control for performance-intensive apps. Question 13. How do you store data before transformation with EKS Container App on EC2? It's inefficient to use AWS controllers for Kubernetes with DAX cache or MemoryDB database. Also, storage object for external NFS systems requires inefficient network calls. Most advisable is to store the data first in ephemeral node volumes of EKS container before transferring to S3. Question 14. How do you realize with least overhead an API-invoked Python script to return results to API gateway of a React.js website? Inadequate to avoid control and overhead are customized scripts or mock events with scheduled Lambda functions. The solution is to use Lambda function with low overhead and concurrency for highest scalability. With the understanding of apps and compute for data engineers, you are ready now for more details. We wish you further insights with abylead videos.